In November 1942, German field reports from Stalingrad began using a word that had rarely appeared in Wehrmacht communications since the start of the war: encirclement. Soviet armored formations were advancing from both the north and south, and within days, the German Sixth Army would be cut off from its supply lines. Commanders on the ground requested authorization to withdraw westward while movement was still possible. Instead, an order arrived from Adolf Hitler's headquarters that stunned even the most loyal officers. The army would remain in place. Stalingrad was to be held at all costs. What had begun as a strategic push toward the oil fields of the Caucasus had evolved into something far more symbolic. The industrial city on the Volga carried the name of Joseph Stalin, and its capture promised enormous propaganda value for the German Reich. By late 1942, however, the objective was no longer about securing a river crossing or protecting the southern flank. It had become a personal contest of prestige between two regimes locked in total war. To abandon the city would be to concede not only territory but psychological ground across Europe and the Eastern Front. Inside the ruined factories and shattered apartment blocks, nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers waited for clarity. Supplies were dwindling, temperatures were dropping, Soviet forces were messing. Yet Hitler viewed the situation through a different lens. He believed the Sixth Army was not trapped but fixed in position, anchoring German control of southern Russia. Withdrawal, in his mind, would trigger a chain reaction of retreats across the entire front. Holding Stalingrad became less a matter of military practicality and more a demonstration of resolve. As Soviet troops prepared to close the ring, the fate of the Sixth Army was already being decided hundreds of miles away. What might have been a tactical withdrawal was transforming into a test of ideology and authority. And once framed in those terms, retreat would become almost impossible to authorize. When German forces crossed into the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, they carried with them the confidence of a military that had not yet experienced strategic defeat. Operation Barbarossa opened with the largest invasion in history, involving more than 3 million Axis troops advancing across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies collapsed under the force of coordinated armor, infantry, and air power. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. Vast territories fell. German commanders believed the campaign might be concluded before winter. By autumn 1941, forward elements of the Wehrmacht had reached the outskirts of Moscow. The rapid advance reinforced Hitler's conviction that the Soviet state was structurally weak and would eventually disintegrate under sustained pressure. Yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. Industrial production shifted eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. New armies were raised. As winter set in, German troops found themselves overstretched and underprepared for prolonged conflict. The failure to seize Moscow marked a turning point. The war in the east would not be a short campaign, but a grinding struggle of resources and endurance. In 1940, Hitler redirected German strategy toward the south. The objective was to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, depriving the Soviet Union of critical fuel supplies while securing resources for Germany's own war effort. The plan, known as Case Blue, divided German forces across a vast operational area. Army Group A pushed toward the Caucasus. Army Group B, including the Sixth Army, advanced toward the Volga and the industrial hub of Stalingrad. Early successes masked the risks of this dispersion. German formations advanced hundreds of miles across open steppe, stretching supply lines and exposing flanks guarded by Allied Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units. By late summer 1942, the German advance had reached its operational limits. Logistics strained under the distance. Fuel and ammunition deliveries became inconsistent. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders studied the exposed flanks of the Sixth Army and prepared a counteroffensive designed not to defend the city alone, but to encircle the forces fighting within it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform Stalingrad from a strategic objective into the focal point of the entire Eastern Front. By September 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had moved beyond conventional military objectives and entered the realm of psychological warfare. German forces under General Friedrich Paulus fought block by block through a city that no longer resembled an industrial center, but a field of ruins. Luftwaffe bombing had reduced entire districts to rubble, collapsing factories, apartment blocks, and rail depots. Yet the destruction worked against the attackers. Every shattered building became a defensive strongpoint. Soviet units embedded themselves within the debris, turning streets and stairwells into fortified positions that slowed every German advance. Reports reaching Berlin emphasized incremental gains. Districts were captured, Soviet forces were pushed back toward the Volga River. But the reality on the ground told a different story. Each block required days of fighting. Casualties mounted steadily. Ammunition and fuel deliveries struggled to keep pace with demand. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga at night in small boats and barges, sustaining the defense despite heavy losses. The battle consumed men and material at a rate German planners had not anticipated. Hitler's focus on Stalingrad intensified as the fighting dragged on. He issued increasingly detailed operational directives, often bypassing senior commanders to dictate tactical movements from afar. Withdrawal from contested positions, even when they held little strategic value, was forbidden. The city had become a symbol. Its capture would validate months of costly campaigning. Its loss would undermine Germany's credibility among allies and occupied territories alike. For Hitler, relinquishing ground in a city bearing Stalin's name was politically unacceptable. German field commanders recognized the growing danger. The Sixth Army was advancing deep into urban combat, while its flanks stretched across open steppe held by less experienced Allied formations. Intelligence reports indicated Soviet troop concentrations building beyond those lines. Requests to shorten the front or reposition to more defensible terrain were repeatedly denied. What had begun as an operational objective had transformed into a matter of prestige, and in a war increasingly shaped by ideology, prestige often outweighed practicality. Before dawn on 19 November 1942, Soviet artillery opened a massive bombardment across the northern flank of the German position. Thousands of guns fired in coordinated volleys, targeting Romanian divisions that guarded the approaches to Stalingrad. Within hours, Soviet armored formations and infantry surged forward through the smoke and snow. Defensive lines collapsed under the pressure. Communications faltered. By midday, entire sectors had been overrun. The offensive, codenamed Operation Uranus, was not aimed at the city itself, but at the vulnerable forces protecting the Sixth Army's supply routes. The following day, a second Soviet thrust struck from the south. German and Allied units attempting to regroup found themselves attacked from multiple directions. Within 72 hours, Soviet spearheads advancing from north and south linked up near the town of Kalash on the Don River. The encirclement was complete. More than 250,000 Axis troops inside Stalingrad were now cut off from ground supply and reinforcement. For the first time in the campaign, the initiative had shifted decisively to the Red Army. German commanders reacted immediately. General Paulus and his staff assessed available fuel and concluded that a breakout attempt remained feasible if ordered without delay. Several senior officers urged permission to withdraw westward and re-establish contact with German lines. Their appeals reached Hitler's headquarters, where the situation was interpreted differently. Hitler declared Stalingrad a fortress that would be held and supplied by air until relief forces could reopen the corridor. Hermann Göring assured him the Luftwaffe possessed the capacity to deliver the hundreds of tons of daily supplies required. The estimate was overly optimistic, but it reinforced Hitler's decision. As Soviet forces consolidated their encirclement, conditions inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Airfields became targets for constant artillery and air attack. Transport aircraft struggled to land and depart under fire. Each passing day reduced the Sixth Army's ability to maneuver or escape, yet the directive from Berlin remained unchanged. Stalingrad would be held. Withdrawal was no longer under consideration. In December 1942, German commanders inside the Stalingrad pocket received news that briefly revived hope. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, newly appointed to command Army Group Dom, had begun assembling a relief force to break through Soviet lines and restore contact with the encircled Sixth Army. The operation, later known as Winter Storm, represented Germany's last realistic chance to extract its trapped forces before the situation became irreversible. Armored divisions, including elements of the 4th Panzer Army, advanced eastward across the frozen steppe, pushing through determined Soviet resistance. By mid-December, Manstein's spearheads had advanced to within roughly 50 kilometers of the Stalingrad perimeter. German officers inside the pocket monitored radio transmissions closely, calculating distances and fuel reserves. A coordinated breakout toward the approaching relief force could still succeed if executed immediately. Senior staff within the Sixth Army prepared contingency plans for such a maneuver. They knew the remaining in place would gradually erode their ability to move at all. Field stocks were dwindling. and each day of inactivity reduced the likelihood of escape. Yet, authorization never came. Hitler insisted the Sixth Army remain in its defensive positions and await full relief rather than attempt a withdrawal that might abandon heavy equipment and territory. He feared that a retreat, even a successful one, would trigger wider instability along the Eastern Front and damage German morale. The army inside Stalingrad was ordered to stand fast. Paulus, bound by direct command and lacking the authority to act independently, complied. The brief window for coordinated movement closed. Meanwhile, Soviet forces launched counterattacks against Manstein's advancing columns. Without support from within the encirclement, the relief effort stalled. By late December, German units were forced onto the defensive and eventually withdrew. Inside Stalingrad, the realization spread that no rescue was imminent. Supplies delivered by air covered only a fraction of daily requirements. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Vehicles stood idle for lack of fuel. The promise of relief had sustained morale for weeks. Its failure left only endurance and uncertainty as winter deepened around the trapped army. By January 1943, the Sixth Army inside Stalingrad had ceased to function as a cohesive fighting force. Soviet units tightened their encirclement and advanced methodically into shrinking German-held sectors. Artillery fire struck remaining airfields and supply depots with increasing precision, further reducing the Luftwaffe's ability to deliver food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Daily airlift requirements exceeded 600 tons. On most days, fewer than 100 tons arrived. The shortfall became catastrophic. Rations were cut repeatedly. Soldiers received minimal bread, thin soup, and occasional horse meat. Fuel shortages forced the abandonment of vehicles and heavy weapons. Wounded men crowded into unheated shelters with little medical care available. Frostbite cases multiplied as temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Communications with Berlin continued, but the tone of reports shifted from operational updates to appeals for relief or authorization to act independently. Requests for breakout attempts or negotiated surrender went unanswered. Hitler maintained his directive that the Sixth Army hold its ground. He believed continued resistance would pin down large Soviet formations and stabilize other sectors of the front. German propaganda framed the encircled forces as steadfast defenders engaged in a heroic stand. In reality, organized resistance was fragmenting. Units became isolated from one another. Ammunition reserves dwindled to the point where some formations could no longer return fire except in brief engagements. The army that had once driven deep into Soviet territory was now reduced to scattered pockets struggling to survive. On 31 January 1943, Soviet troops reached General Paulus's headquarters in central Stalingrad. He surrendered shortly afterward, marking the collapse of the southern pocket. Fighting continued briefly in northern sectors until 2 February, when remaining forces ceased resistance. Of the approximately 300,000 Axis personnel trapped during the encirclement, fewer than 100,000 entered Soviet captivity. Only a small percentage would survive the years that followed. The battle had ended. Its consequences, however, would reshape the wider war in ways that were only beginning to unfold. The destruction of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked a profound shift in the trajectory of the Second World War. For the first time since 1939, an entire German field army had been surrounded and eliminated. News of the defeat spread quickly across Europe, carried through diplomatic channels, intercepted communications, and the cautious acknowledgments of German propaganda. The image of relentless Wehrmacht expansion that had defined the early years of the war began to fracture. Axis allies who had committed divisions to the Eastern Front reassessed their position, recognizing that Germany's capacity for decisive victory was no longer assured. On the Eastern Front itself, the strategic balance shifted almost immediately. Soviet forces, having absorbed and then destroyed one of Germany's most experienced armies, seized the initiative. In the months following the surrender, Red Army offensives pushed westward across broad sectors, forcing German formations into successive withdrawals. German planners struggled to stabilize defensive lines while reallocating reserves to contain new threats. The loss of manpower, equipment, and morale at Stalingrad could not be easily replaced. It represented not only a tactical defeat, but a severe erosion of Germany's operational strength. Within Germany, official statements framed the outcome as a heroic stand against overwhelming odds. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay growing awareness that the war had entered a new phase. Military leadership faced the reality of fighting a prolonged defensive campaign against an adversary whose industrial capacity and manpower reserves continued to expand. Allied leaders in London and Washington interpreted the events at Stalingrad as confirmation that sustained pressure on multiple fronts would eventually overwhelm the Axis. The city on the Volga had become more than a battlefield. It had become a signal that the momentum of the conflict was beginning to turn. As Soviet advances gathered pace and German forces adjusted to a new strategic reality, the consequences of the decision to hold Stalingrad reverberated far beyond the ruins of the city. What had been intended as a demonstration of strength now stood as evidence of vulnerability. In the years after the war, the devastated landscape of Stalingrad was gradually rebuilt. Factories resumed production. New apartment blocks rose where ruins had once dominated the skyline. The city, later renamed Volgograd, became a place of remembrance as well as renewal. Memorials and cemeteries marked the sites where one of the most destructive battles in modern history had unfolded. Beneath reconstructed streets lay the remains of soldiers from both sides, reminders of a campaign defined by endurance and loss. Historians examining the decisions that shaped the battle have often returned to the question of why withdrawal was never authorized. Military logic alone cannot fully explain it. Strategic concerns about maintaining the front, fears of broader collapse, and the limitations of available transport all played roles. Yet the refusal to retreat also reflected a deeper conviction within the German leadership that willpower could compensate for material disadvantage. Holding ground regardless of cost was seen as essential to maintaining authority and morale. In the case of Stalingrad, that conviction prolonged the battle long after its outcome had become predictable. For the soldiers who endured the encirclement, the consequences were immediate and personal. Months of fighting gave way to hunger, exposure, and eventual captivity. For Germany, the loss signaled a transition from expansion to defense, from confidence to attrition. The decision to hold the city did not merely result in defeat, it magnified its scale and impact. Today, the banks of the Volga carry little visible trace of the winter when the city became the focal point of a global conflict. Traffic moves through rebuilt streets, visitors walk through memorial parks where the sounds of battle once echoed. Yet the story of Stalingrad endures as a reminder of how a single decision, sustained beyond its practical limits, can alter the course of history. In that winter of 1942 and 1943, refusal became destiny, and a city that could not be abandoned became the place where a war began to turn.